I used to think my life was set in stone, predictable, routine, and void of any unexpected surprises. At 54, I had grown accustomed to the silence of my home, the creak of the same floorboards under my feet, and the comfort of an unchanging schedule. Mornings were spent with coffee and crossword puzzles, afternoons tending to the plants on my balcony, and evenings wrapped in the quiet hum of an old television. Widowed for over a decade, my days blurred into one another, like pages of a book where the same sentence was repeated endlessly. I wasn't unhappy exactly. It was more like I had accepted that the vibrant, unpredictable parts of life were behind me. It was on an unremarkable Tuesday, as I pushed my cart down the bread aisle of the local grocery store, that something shifted. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the air carried the faint smell of baked goods. My list was neatly folded in my hand, a small act of control over my small world. "Excuse me," a warm voice interrupted my thoughts. I turned, expecting to see another shopper, perhaps a harried mother or an elderly man needing assistance. Instead, I found myself looking into the kind eyes of a man who couldn't have been more than 35. His hair was dark, slightly tousled, and there was a genuine smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You wouldn't happen to know where they keep the sesame bagels, would you?" he asked, holding up an empty basket. For a moment, I was caught off guard, not just by his question, but by the way his presence seemed to fill the space around us. I gestured toward a shelf nearby. "I think they're over there, next to the whole wheat." "Thanks," he said, his smile deepening. "I always get lost in this place." As he turned to walk away, I found myself smiling too, a reflex I hadn't used in a while. It wasn't the kind of interaction that should have lingered in my mind, but as I finished my shopping, his voice replayed in my head. Later that evening, as I unpacked my groceries, I realized the moment had left me with something I hadn't felt in years. A spark of curiosity. Who was he? Why had such a simple exchange felt so significant? I didn't know it yet, but that brief encounter in the bread aisle was the beginning of something that would unravel my carefully ordered life. Something I didn't even know I was missing the next time I saw him. It was purely by chance. Or at least that's what I told myself. The same grocery store, just a week later. I was scanning the produce section, debating whether I really needed another bunch of bananas, when I heard his voice again. "Making the tough decisions, huh?" I looked up, and there he was, the sesame bagel man, holding a bag of apples and grinning like we were old friends. I laughed softly. Bananas have a short window of perfection. It's a gamble. "That's true," he said, tossing an apple into his cart. "But at least they don't bruise as easily as these." We fell into an easy conversation, as if we'd known each other for years instead of exchanging just a few words a week ago. His name was Ethan, and he worked as a graphic designer. He had moved to the neighborhood recently, and was still figuring out the lay of the land, as he put it. Before I knew it, we were walking the aisles together, swapping stories about the best local coffee shops and sharing tips on cooking. He had a knack for making even the most mundane topics, like the merits of different pasta shapes, feel fascinating. "I'll let you in on a secret," he said, leaning in slightly as if to confide something profound. "Rigatoni beats spaghetti every time. Better sauce distribution." I chuckled. "That's quite the bold statement. I'm more of a linguine fan myself." "Ah, rebel," he teased. When we parted ways at the checkout, he waved with a casualness that felt genuine. "Maybe I'll see you around again." I didn't expect to see him so soon. A few days later, I was on my morning walk through the park when I spotted him sitting on a bench, sketchbook in hand. He looked so absorbed in his work that I hesitated to interrupt, but something pushed me forward. "Caught you in your natural habitat," I said lightly. He looked up, surprised but pleased. "Hey, didn't expect to see you here. Care to join?" I sat down, and we spent the better part of an hour talking. He showed me his sketches, explaining the stories behind them, and asked about my life. At first, I was hesitant to share too much. What could a young man like him possibly find interesting about a middle-aged woman's quiet existence? But he listened intently, asking thoughtful questions, and for the first time in years, I felt truly seen. Our chance meetings became less coincidental and more intentional. He'd suggest grabbing coffee after a run-in, or I'd linger at the grocery store, secretly hoping to bump into him. Each conversation felt like a piece of sunshine warming a part of me I'd long forgotten. I started to notice the way my days felt lighter, my evenings brighter. Ethan brought a spark of novelty to my life, a reminder that even the smallest moments could feel alive if shared with the right person. And yet, somewhere in the back of my mind, a tiny voice whispered, "This can't be more than a friendship, can it?" The realization came slowly, like the first hints of spring after a long, relentless winter. Ethan and I had decided to meet at the park one Saturday morning. It had become a ritual of sorts. He'd sketch while I read, and our conversations would meander from books to art to the little oddities of life. That day, he brought me a cup of coffee from my favorite cafe, remembering exactly how I liked it. A dash of cream, no sugar. "Thought you could use some fuel," he said, handing it to me with a warm smile. "Thank you," I said, feeling a flutter in my chest that I immediately pushed aside. We sat under a sprawling oak tree, the dappled sunlight dancing over us. He was sketching again, his hand moving fluidly over the page, his brow furrowed in concentration. I stole a glance at him, intending to comment on his work, but the words caught in my throat. There was something about the way he looked in that moment, focused yet relaxed, a quiet confidence in his every movement, that made my heart skip a beat. It was a feeling I hadn't experienced in years, one I barely recognized. I turned my attention back to my book, but the words blurred together. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to answer. What was this? Admiration? Infatuation? Something deeper? Over the next few weeks, the feeling grew, stubborn and insistent. It wasn't just his kindness or his laugh that lingered long after our conversations ended. It was the way he made me feel, alive, curious, as though I was discovering pieces of myself I thought I'd lost. One evening, after our usual coffee outing, he walked me to my car. The streetlights cast a soft glow over his features, and as he spoke, I found myself watching his lips, the way they curved around his words. "You always have such interesting stories," he said, his voice tinged with genuine admiration. I laughed, trying to deflect. "I doubt my tales of grocery store drama are that riveting." "They are to me," he said simply, and the sincerity in his tone made my chest tighten. That night, lying awake in bed, I admitted the truth to myself. I was drawn to him in a way that went far beyond friendship. It wasn't just his youth or his charm. It was the way he looked at the world, at me, with such openness and warmth. But with the realization came a wave of fear. What would he think if he knew? What would others think? The age difference felt like a wall I couldn't climb, an unspoken barrier that kept me firmly in place. Yet, beneath the fear, there was a flicker of hope, small but persistent. I hadn't felt this alive in years. Could it be possible? Even in the face of all the reasons it shouldn't be, one Thursday, after they'd talked for what felt like hours about the best ways to make homemade bread, Eric turned to her with an easy grin. "You know, Margaret, you're the only person I've met who seems to enjoy grocery shopping as much as I do." She laughed, the sound startling her for its genuineness. "I wouldn't go that far. I think it's the company that makes it enjoyable." The words slipped out before she had time to catch them, and she felt a warmth creep into her cheeks. Eric didn't seem to notice. He was busy picking up a box of flour, reading the label like it was the most important thing in the world. But Margaret noticed. She noticed everything. The way his hair fell messily across his forehead, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the way he spoke about the simplest things with such energy that it made her feel alive again. That evening, as she unpacked her groceries, Margaret found herself thinking about him. Not just his kindness or his humor, but him, Eric. His presence, his voice, the way he made her feel seen and valued in a way she hadn't felt in years. Her thoughts startled her. She was in her 50s, a widow who'd long since put away the idea of romantic entanglements. Eric was young, vibrant, and full of a life she sometimes felt she'd already lived. What could he possibly see in her beyond a friendly face at the grocery store? Yet, as the days passed, she couldn't shake the flutter in her chest when she thought of him. She told herself it was silly, that it was just the thrill of something new. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The next time they met, her heart betrayed her. He reached for a bag of oranges on the top shelf, and his hand brushed hers as he handed one to her. "Here," he said, smiling as if it was the most natural thing in the world. Her breath caught for a second, her heart racing at the simplest touch. It was then, standing in the fluorescent glow of the produce section, that Margaret felt the truth settle over her like a gentle storm. She was falling for him. It was absurd, illogical, and impossible. Yet, there it was, undeniable and unrelenting. Her heart, after years of dormancy, was waking up, and it terrified her for days. I wrestled with the chaos inside me. It was as though my emotions were a storm, each wave bringing a new blend of exhilaration and dread. On one hand, there was the undeniable joy Ethan brought into my life. His presence had turned my gray, predictable days into something vibrant and full of possibility. On the other, there was the ever-present voice in my mind, whispering doubts and judgments. He's too young. People will talk. What if he only sees you as a friend? I began to second-guess everything. Every smile he gave me, every lingering glance, every moment of laughter. Were they just kindness? Or could there be something more? One afternoon, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a photograph of myself from years ago. I barely recognized the young woman smiling back, bright-eyed, full of dreams, unmarked by time or loss. She felt like a stranger now, buried under years of routine and solitude. Who am I kidding? I murmured to the empty room, tears welling in my eyes. I couldn't stop thinking about what people would say if they knew how I felt. Society had always been quick to judge women like me, older, vulnerable, daring to seek love outside the confines of what was appropriate. I imagined the whispers, the pointed looks, the quiet ridicule. And yet, in the quiet moments of the day, I caught myself smiling at the memory of his laughter. I felt a warmth I hadn't known in years, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, life had more to offer than I'd dared to believe. One evening, while folding laundry, I heard my phone buzz. It was a message from Ethan. Want to grab coffee tomorrow? I found a new place I think you'll love. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. A simple invitation, yet it felt monumental. I typed back a quick reply, sounds great. What time? Before setting the phone down and taking a deep breath. That night, as I lay in bed, I allowed myself a small rebellion against my fears. What if, for once, I stopped worrying about what the world thought? What if I chose to follow this feeling, even if it led to heartache? The thought was both terrifying and thrilling. For the first time in years, I felt on the brink of something unpredictable, something new. Perhaps I realized the scariest part wasn't the judgment of others or even the possibility of rejection. It was daring to believe that I could deserve this kind of happiness, no matter how fleeting or complicated it might be. With that thought, I closed my eyes, feeling the faintest glimmer of peace amidst the turmoil. Whatever came next, I would face it. The idea came to me in a moment of quiet resolve. As I stood at the window watching the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the garden, a thought bubbled to the surface. I want him to see this part of my world. It was a simple notion, yet it carried weight. Inviting Ethan to my home would change the unspoken boundaries we'd kept. It was one thing to meet at a cafe, or linger by the grocery aisle. It was entirely another to let him step into my private space, into the life I'd built for myself over decades. I hesitated. What would he think of the small cottage with its faded curtains and well-worn furniture? Would he notice the creaks in the floorboards or the cluttered shelves filled with relics of a life lived mostly alone? But as I thought of him, his easy laugh, the way he listened so intently, the warmth in his eyes, I realized how much I wanted to share these pieces of myself. I spent the next day preparing, though I tried to tell myself it wasn't anything special. I baked a lemon cake, his favorite, and arranged fresh flowers on the table. Each small act felt like a quiet declaration, a way of saying, this is who I am. This is where I belong. When I finally worked up the courage to call him, my voice trembled slightly. Ethan, I began, feeling the words catch in my throat. I was wondering if you'd like to come over for tea sometime. It's nothing fancy, but... Before I could second-guess myself, he interrupted with that familiar enthusiasm. I'd love to. When? The ease of his response was like a balm, soothing the nerves that had been building all morning. Tomorrow afternoon, I ventured. Perfect. I'll bring my favorite tea blend, he said with a grin in his voice. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, letting the reality of what I'd just done sink in. The next day, as the afternoon approached, I caught myself pacing the living room, adjusting pillows and smoothing tablecloths that didn't need fixing. When the knock came at the door, my heart skipped a beat. I opened it to find Ethan standing there, a warm smile on his face and a small bag of tea in his hand. "This place suits you," he said as he stepped inside, his eyes taking in the cozy details. His words were simple, yet they carried a weight I hadn't expected. For the first time in years, I felt truly seen, not just for who I had been, but for who I was now. As we settled in with steaming cups of tea, the conversation flowed effortlessly. There was something grounding about sharing the space with him, about letting him into a world I had always kept so carefully guarded. And yet, beneath the warmth and laughter, there was a quiet tension, a question that neither of us had yet dared to voice. The evening unfolded in the most unexpected of ways. As we talked, the hours seemed to slip through our fingers like sand. Our laughter mingled with the gentle hum of the old house, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of time pressing down on me. Ethan's presence was like a new rhythm in my life, a melody I hadn't known I was missing until it was there, filling the spaces that had once felt hollow. He was unlike anyone I had known, his energy bright and unburdened by the heaviness I had carried for so many years. At some point, we moved to the small sofa by the window, our conversation having turned into a comfortable silence. I found myself watching him, really watching him for the first time since he'd walked through the door. There was something about the way the fading light caught in his hair, the quiet confidence in his posture as he leaned back, his hands casually folded in his lap. I'd never been one to think of myself as someone to fall for a man younger than me. Perhaps it was society's voice in my ear, or my own fears of feeling out of place. But now, with him sitting just inches away, I couldn't deny the depth of the connection that had bloomed between us. It was something raw and real, something I hadn't expected. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt the air between us shift. A quiet understanding passed between us, something unspoken but clear. The world outside seemed to vanish, and in that moment, there was only Ethan and me. He shifted slightly, and then, without a word, reached for my hand. His fingers brushed against mine, tentative at first, as though he, too, was testing the waters of something new. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice soft, almost vulnerable. I swallowed, finding the courage to answer. "I'm more than all right, actually." The words came out before I could think about them, and suddenly I was afraid. Afraid of how much he meant to me, of how my heart was beginning to open in ways I hadn't thought possible. But there was no going back now. The way his thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand spoke volumes. There was no hesitancy in him. He wanted this just as I did. And then, in the stillness of that moment, his lips found mine. It wasn't a rush. There was no urgency, no overwhelming force behind it. Just a soft, tentative kiss, as if he, too, was savoring the quiet sweetness of what we were sharing. I closed my eyes, letting myself melt into the sensation of his warmth, the softness of his lips, the certainty of his touch. For the first time in years, I felt fully alive. When the kiss broke, I kept my eyes closed for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around us like a blanket. I didn't need to say anything. We both knew. The connection was undeniable in its simplicity and purity. We didn't need to rush anything. The world outside could wait. In that room, in that moment, it was just the two of us, two souls, linked together by something both unexpected and undeniable. The days that followed were filled with a quiet kind of magic. I found myself smiling at the smallest things, his texts, his calls, the way he remembered my favorite coffee creamer, the way he laughed at my bad jokes. I would look in the mirror and see a woman who had been startled awake, who had forgotten the color of joy. But with Ethan, I remembered. I also started to wonder about the path that had brought me here. I had lived so many years without even realizing what I was missing. At times, I found myself questioning my own choices, my own reluctance to ever dream of something different. Age had always been a factor I had to account for, something that society had ingrained in me. The rules were clear. Men were supposed to be older. That was the way the world worked. But Ethan had turned that belief upside down. I had never considered love outside of the bounds I'd set for myself. Never imagined that I could feel such a fierce connection with someone so much younger. And yet, with him I did. And it didn't feel wrong or awkward or out of place. It felt natural, as if it had always been meant to be. There was no denying the fear that lingered in the back of my mind. The fear of judgment from others, of what people might think if they knew. People like me, older, set in our ways, weren't supposed to fall for younger men. It was a narrative we'd been taught to believe. Love was for the young, for the carefree, for those with their futures still ahead of them. But I had lived long enough to know that love wasn't bound by age, by time, or by rules. Love was something fluid, something that transcended the limitations we tried to impose on it. It wasn't about the years between us, but about what we had in this moment, in this connection. It wasn't about what the world might say, but about what we felt. And I felt something real, something undeniable. I could feel my heart opening in ways it hadn't in years. And as much as I was scared of the consequences, as much as I feared the judgment, I couldn't bring myself to regret a single moment with him. There was a tenderness in his touch, a lightness in his gaze, that made me feel seen, valued, cherished in a way I hadn't felt in so long. And so, as I lay there one night, after another evening spent wrapped in his warmth, I let the doubts fall away. I let go of the societal voices, the fears, the limitations. The truth was simple and clear. Love wasn't a matter of years or expectations, but of how two people made each other feel. And in that moment, I knew I had found something extraordinary. Ethan was my equal. And in that knowledge, I found a freedom I hadn't known I needed. The evening sun streamed through the windows, casting soft golden hues over the room. I sat quietly at the table, a cup of tea in my hands, as Ethan moved around the kitchen preparing dinner. The hum of conversation flowed between us as easily as it always had. The differences in our ages no longer felt like a barrier. If anything, they felt like the very thing that made our connection so unique. I could feel the weight of time, but it didn't hold me back anymore. Every moment with him felt precious, a reminder that love wasn't bound by the years that passed or the expectations others placed on us. It was in the shared silences, the gentle laughter, the tenderness that crept into our every touch. This love, our love, was an unexpected gift. It wasn't something I had planned, nor was it something I could have ever predicted. But now, in this quiet space, with the world beyond the walls of our home fading into the background, I knew one thing for certain. I had never been more alive. As I looked at Ethan, I realized that love didn't stop at a certain age. It didn't have an expiration date. I had spent so many years doubting myself, doubting my worth, believing that love belonged only to the young, that love was a fleeting thing. But here we were, our hearts intertwined, creating a story that was just beginning, no matter what the world might say. And so I decided to embrace it all. The doubts, the fears, the societal norms that tried to tell me what was and wasn't acceptable, all of it. I let it go. Love was something you couldn't control, something you couldn't predict. And what I had with Ethan was a love that was mine, unique and beautiful in its own right. I had spent so many years waiting for the life I thought I was supposed to have. But now I knew that life wasn't something to be expected. It was something to be lived. And I was living it now, fully and freely, in the arms of someone who saw me, who loved me, not for who I was supposed to be, but for who I was in this moment. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Love had arrived in the most unexpected of places, and with it came a sense of peace and freedom that I had never known before. As Ethan reached out, offering me a plate of food with a playful grin, I realized that this was just the beginning. Love, real and pure, had no limits. It didn't matter how old we were or how the world viewed us. It was about what we shared and how we made each other feel. And in that moment, I knew there was no turning back. This love was worth every second,